the Human Rights Council, this group of states that meet in Geneva regularly and work for the advancement and protection of human rights worldwide. It's a very important body at the UN, and quite some years ago, they decided to put together these different mechanisms that are called special procedures and are composed by special rapporteurs, independent experts, so those are individual mandates, and working groups, which are collective mandates, on different thematic issues, so that we are an independent branch that can report directly to the Human Rights Council. We're not employees of the UN. And so it's a very interesting place to be because I'm an independent expert. And I can provide independent advice to states, independent perspectives on human rights in the context of business activities, which is specialty of the mandate. We are 5 members, and again, 1 per region. I'm the representative for our region. And our mandate is based on the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. I will be sharing a little bit more about that, those standards that were adopted in 2011 by the Human Rights Council, and then the General Assembly backed them up as well. And these is the standard that guides, the business and human rights agenda. So it has become very important, and nobody denies really the relevance of protecting human rights in the context of business activities. Maybe some decades ago, this wasn't very clear. Human rights was a matter of states only, but now it is a consensus that business have to do with human rights. They can contribute to, the fulfillment of human rights when they, for example, respect and guarantee the labor rights of their workers, when they take measures to reduce their impact in the environment, when they take measures to improve the lives of the communities, but they can also harm human rights. It's not only state actors or individuals, but also companies can harm human rights. And that was a conversation and was a discussion is not a discussion anymore. Everybody, mostly globally, this is the global conversation, the global trend, agrees that companies have to do with human rights and that they need to prevent any potential harm they could have on human rights. So there is a lot of movement, a lot of things have happened since the adoption of the guiding principles in 2011. And I'll share a little bit more in my second intervention when I discuss with you the ABC of the business and human rights agenda. So for now, I'll pass it back to Joanna. Welcome, everybody. This is a very important conversation, hopefully the first of many. Hopefully we can start meeting in person as of next year and have different dialogues and engage more and more stakeholders. This is a multi-stakeholder agenda. We can't do it without the private sector. We can't do it without local communities, human rights defenders, unions, and civil society organizations, academia, and of course, state actors and public servants that have human rights under their duties. So welcome everybody, and thank you for being here this morning. Thank you, Joanna.
Fernanda, thank you so much. I would like to remember that we have simultaneous interpretation available, so you can switch from the language in the bottom below your screen. You will find the English or Spanish channel, so please feel free to switch between those channels to have a better experience in this dialogue. Well, now, as well as I said before, this is a joint effort between a lot of offices from the United Nations, like the High Commissioner Office for Human Rights, UNDP, UNICEF, also the Working Group on Business and Human Rights. And for now, I would like to pass the floor to Juliet Solomon. She's a program specialist of citizen security, human rights, and rule of law at UNDP Regional Center. And also Romain Sibyl, who is corporate alliances specialist at UNICEF Latin America and the Caribbean, to give a welcome and some introductory remarks. So Juliet, Romain, welcome. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here, very happy to be giving remarks on behalf of UNDP at this event, which has taken some time to come to fruition, excuse me. In this regard, I would like to give particular recognition to my colleagues Victoria De Mello, Gloria Mansotti, and Jairo Acuna, who is our team leader on governance and peace building at the UNDP Regional Hub in Panama. Before I go further, I would also like to acknowledge the presence today of our colleagues from CARICOM, Mr. Brian Bellevue, who is the Program Manager for Foreign and Community Relations, and Mr. Sherwin Stevenson, who is Program Manager for Crime and Security. And we hope that their participation today will be the start of a regional partnership to promote the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. I just wanted to quickly say that this is, that UNDP has a number of ways in which we would like to support initiatives that countries themselves have started undertaking. And in fact, in November, on the 29th of November, UNDP attended and presented at an awareness-raising day as part of the St. Lucia Bureau of Standards working group. They're chairing an ISO working group on the development of an international standard for human trafficking, forced labor, and modern slavery. And it was a great pleasure to work in conjunction with them and the panel of experts that they have come together. And I believe that Alison may be saying more about this later on, but we felt that that was a very good step in terms of building a regional partnership and taking forward this work in the region. And I think I will leave it there just to say that in terms of what we as UNDP can offer, in terms of business and human rights, we offer technical advisory support to governments, regional peer learning and capacity building on the UN guiding principles. We help develop human rights policies, due diligence processes, and we support civil society and national human rights institutions to improve accountability. And just finally, our next initiative, an upcoming initiative, is that we are going to launch a virtual course on the role of business in the protection and promotion of human rights, specifically for the Caribbean, and it's being adapted to the Caribbean context. It is part of UNDP's regional programming, and it's part of UNDP Business and Human Rights Academy, and will be launched early next year. So please stay tuned, and I look forward to having lots of inquiries as to how to join the course. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Juliet. Romain?
Yes, thank you. Good morning, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be today with you in a region that is close to my heart, because we've been working closely with different actors in the last 2 years, in particular in the context of engaging business in emergency. Thank you for colleagues co-organizing the panel today, this first dialogue for the region, from the Caribbean, from the UN Human Rights and Business Working Group, from UNDP, and from the Group of Responsible Business Conduct in Latin America and the Caribbean. This agenda of business and human rights is a new agenda for the Caribbean, which will require a lot of collective work between leading public and private sector, and will require us all to get more knowledgeable about this. This is the first dialogue, and we call for this collaborative work in promoting the business and human rights agenda across the region of the Caribbean, and get an active participation, as Fernanda was saying, from the government, from companies, from multi-stakeholder platforms, but also civil society and other representatives of potentially affected populations and rights holders. So today we invite companies to strengthen their work on corporate social responsibility, on sustainability, and start analyzing, prioritizing, and developing solutions to remedy to their potential and actual impacts that they can have on human rights and on children's rights. We also invite governments of the Caribbean to strengthen the regulatory frameworks to support companies to ensure that these can respect the human rights. It's inevitable that business, whether small or large, will interact with and have effects on the life of children, both directly and indirectly. Children are stakeholders of the business, as consumers, as family members of employees, as young workers, as future employees, and future business leaders. They will be in your place tomorrow. At the same time, children are key members of the communities and the environments where your businesses operate. The potential impacts that you might have on children goes way beyond child labor. UNICEF is a leader on the business and human rights and children rights agenda in Latin America since we launched in 2012 the Children Rights and Business Principles. So these are 10 principles that invite the businesses and governments to have a holistic analysis of the potential impacts that business might have on children. We guide companies and business sector stakeholders on different prevention and mitigation measures through evidence tools, guiding resources, impact assessments, etc., to make sure they can better manage, understand and manage the impacts that they have on children. We also provide technical assistance to governments to adopt or enforce national policies regulating children's rights in business and human rights in business in general, and on certain thematics that I'm gonna describe. Apart from this general work that we do on sensitizing the governments, the business stakeholders, and the whole community on explaining which are the business, the children rights that might be affected, we support certain thematic agendas. First of all, is family-friendly policies in the workplace, making sure that families can take care of their children while being workers of the companies. We have a strong agenda already in Dominican Republic, but also in the Caribbean islands, where we work with CARICHAM to develop the first toolkit a couple of years ago. We work also to protect children online in digital environments and make sure their rights are not being violated when they navigate in digital environments. We also promote, and we did a study last year on how marketing and advertising can affect the gender norms, thus affect the gender balance and the capacity of all children and adolescents to fulfill all their rights. And we have developed this study in Jamaica, Barbados, St. Lucia, and Trinidad and Tobago. We also promote healthy environments. We are working with Healthy Caribbean Coalition, for example, to make sure we can regulate and make sure that children have access to healthy food and are not being promoted unhealthy alternatives. And finally, we work, of course, on mitigation and adaptation to climate change and making sure we can engage businesses to prevent climate change, to avoid the effects they have in climate change on children, which are the most sensitive of all the stakeholders they can have, but also to prevent and respond to emergencies to which the Caribbean are very prone. In 2021, we developed a mapping of the business sectors and children's rights in the Caribbean, where we analyzed the regulatory frameworks that exist in the different states of the Caribbean. So we will share that in the chat and probably also per email after that. And we also published last year, when we celebrated the 10 years of the Children's Rights and Business Principles, a roadmap on what we expect governments, companies, and civil society to do regarding children's rights within the next 10 years of the Children's Rights and Business Principles. So we are super enthusiastic, glad that this first dialogue can happen. As Fernanda says, we hope to be able to meet face-to-face very soon and keep on digging on these important agendas. Count on us to support you and make sure that when you consider human rights and business approach, when you try to understand your impacts and when you try to solve them, make sure you can do it on children, making sure you understand how you can be impacting children, but also with children, and invite them to contribute to these important discussions. Thank you so much.
Juliet, Romain, thank you so much, and especially thank you so much for all the work UNDP and UNICEF does in this matter on the region. And now I would like to offer the floor again to Fernanda Hoppenheim to make some introduction to the business and human rights agenda in the framework of the UN Guiding Principles. So Fernanda, welcome again.
Thank you so much, Joanna. I'm going to share my screen. I prepared a little presentation so it's easier to follow. I hope everybody can see it. I hope that's the case. If not, just let me know. Okay. Yeah. Perfect. Thank you. Okay, so I'll go as fast as I can in the 10 minutes we have for this portion. But first, let me start by saying that these are some of the international standards that are prevalent nowadays with regards to the respect of human rights in the context of business activities. We have the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises on responsible business conduct. These guidelines have been around for over almost 50 years, but now there is a new revision from 2023. And even states that are not part of the OECD, but are part of these, are a party to this declaration on multinational enterprises on responsible business conduct, can use the guidelines in their favor to promote responsible business conduct. And since 2011, which was the previous revision of these guidelines, it has been aligned with the guiding principles on business and human rights, incorporating the human rights language. And in the 2023 edition, there are new and stronger provisions with regards to climate change and combating climate change, and also, for example, participation of potentially affected communities, just to give a few examples. Then the ILO also has, well, of course, the ILO has many conventions that protect human rights, including the rights of indigenous peoples in ILO 169, to self-determination and consultation and consent. The rights of women in the workplace, as of the latest convention 190 that protects against harassment and gender-based violence in the workplace. There are other, of course, essential conventions that protect against modern slavery, exploitation, etc. But this tripartite declaration of principles concerning multinational enterprises and social policy are kind of the source of the work that the ILO is doing on business and human rights. And of course, as I was mentioning, the UN developed the guiding principles on business and human rights in 2011, and they were adopted then. And I'm going to go deeper into this particular standard, which is, again, the one that is guiding us in this work around business and human rights. But the three institutions really work well together. Joanna, our colleague that is facilitating this webinar today and will be moderating the panel, is part of a project on responsible business conduct in Latin America and the Caribbean that it's, composed by these three institutions. So all the standards talk to each other rather well, and we try to work as coordinatedly as possible. So going deeper into the guiding principles on business and human rights, okay, they were, as I was saying, adopted in 2011, but unanimously adopted. And this is the framework that is the base of those 31 principles. These are 31 principles organized under 3 pillars, and these are the 3 pillars. So when we refer to pillar 1, we're talking about the obligations of the state to protect human rights. So the duty of the state to protect human rights, again, in particularly against abuses by corporate actors and in the context of business activities. So it doesn't talk about all the obligations around human rights, but it really focuses on the obligations to protect human rights by states in the context of business activities when it comes to corporate abuse. And one essential thing under this pillar is that the states should be leading by example. This means that the state when it acts as an economic actor, it should lead by example. For example, this means that when we talk about state-owned companies or companies that are controlled by the state, this should have human rights provisions, conduct human rights due diligence, which is a process to prevent harm by companies. They should behave the best, let's say, and set the example to the private sector. The same with, and the guiding principles fully apply to the state-owned companies. It also means that, for example, they could use the opportunity of public procurement to include human rights clauses, for example, for contractors with the state. So the state has a contract with a private sector actor, with a private business, then the state should be able to require certain human rights standards from those companies, for example. So there are many ways in which the state can lead by example and implement the guiding principles through different mechanisms or instruments. Typically, national action plans, and I will talk about it a little bit more. These are plans that set out the actions that the state and the state will also require the state will take and require from the private sector, this guides their actions on the implementation of the guiding principles on business and human rights. But they could also develop other public policies that protect human rights in the context of business activities, for example, in certain sectors, and also develop regulation, develop new laws, or strengthen existing laws, strengthen institutions that are part of the state with the aim of fulfilling their duty to protect human rights in the context of business activities. So that's pillar one. Pillar two of this framework is the responsibility of business to respect human rights. So this is the first time that actually an international instrument sets the responsibilities of businesses very clearly when it comes to respecting human rights. First of all, the do no harm principle, that's the essential principle, avoid doing harm. The second thing is that to avoid doing harm, you need to identify potential risks to human rights, potential negative impacts. You need to prevent as much as possible, to mitigate what's not fully preventable, and to address adverse impacts on human rights when they happen. You need to remedy those harms when they happen. So those are the four principles of what it's called the human rights due diligence. Companies conduct due diligence all the time on different things. They prevent risks when it comes to their investments, for example, or if they're going to launch a new product to the market, or if they're going to, partner up with another company or group of companies on a joint venture. So companies know how to do due diligence. So this is just applying, it's not as simple, of course, but it's applying those risk assessments approaches to human rights that are not focused on the risks to the company, but focused on the risks to the people and the environment. And of course, we can go deeper into this, but this is just an introduction for your information. The guiding principles applies to all businesses, big multinational corporations, but also small, medium, and even micro companies, right? So the way it applies to different types of companies can vary, because it's different what you can require from a multinational corporation operating in 20, 30, 50, 60 countries than to a small local company. But of course, a small local company can have some tools and some commitments to human rights and apply them with, the UNDP framework. So the implementation of the guiding principles is through, for example, but not only, public commitments to human rights. So the companies can have their own human rights policies that are public and publicly available, but also conducting human rights due diligence, as I was mentioning. And that's an essential tool that companies can use to fulfill their responsibility to respect human rights and prevent harm. And finally, the third pillar is focused on access to remedy. So victims of corporate abuse can and should have access to remedy through different mechanisms. Of course, you have state judicial mechanisms, the system of justice, victims can sue a company or authorities for negligence or whatever that looks like, using the legal system, using the justice system. That's a possibility, but there should be other mechanisms. Not everything should become a trial necessarily. So states can provide non-judicial mechanisms, for example, through national human rights institutions that can receive complaints from victims of corporate abuse, can issue recommendations, can mediate in finding solutions, for example. The OECD national contact points from those guidelines, I was saying that the states that are party to that declaration and use the guidelines can have in their own governments an office that is called the National Contact Point that can receive complaints, for example, of companies that have breached the guidelines and thus the guiding principles, and they can also provide recommendations, issue reports, and hopefully mediate in finding a solution. Those are just two examples of non-judicial state mechanisms. And of course, companies can have operational level mechanisms, complaint mechanisms, grievance mechanisms that can hear those concerns, hear those complaints, and provide solutions. Remedy is such an essential part of this agenda. That's why it has a pillar dedicated to it. So the 31 guiding principles on business and human rights are organized under this framework of protect, respect, and remedy, pillars 1, 2, and 3. Some key messages for you to bear in mind about the guiding principles. The guiding principles do not create new obligations for states. States are obliged to protect human rights. That's their duty in their national constitutions, typically, but also under international human rights law and the different treaties and conventions that different states are part of. So this is an international obligation of states. So the guiding principles do not create new obligations, but rather clarify such obligations in the context of business activities and also set business responsibilities very clearly. As I was mentioning, the do no harm is a basic principle, and there is a preventive approach in the guiding principles. And that preventive approach can be fulfilled through human rights due diligence processes. As I was saying, risk analysis by companies should not be about the risk to a company. They should have people and the planet at the center. And respect for human rights is also a key contribution to advancing the Sustainable Development Goals. Many companies and certainly many states have, the commitment to advance the Sustainable Development Goals. And of course, respect and protection of human rights in the context of business activities can contribute to advancing the SDGs. So the guiding principles are really aimed at preventing human rights abuses in the context of business activities, for example, modern slavery, child labor, insecure labor condition, environmental impacts, etc. There are many human rights abuses that can happen in the context of business activities. And they have an aim to promote the rights of vulnerable peoples. For example, indigenous peoples, migrants, peoples with disabilities, women and girls, children, to name just a few historically vulnerable populations. So those are some of the key messages I want you to please take home and bear in mind. And I'll go quickly through this part just as an example of what's the landscape nowadays, because I only have 5 more minutes. And I just wanted to share about, the national action plans. As I was saying, the national action plans on business and human rights are a way for states to, or for governments to organize the actions they will be taking to implement the guiding principles in human rights and protect human rights in the context of business activities. It includes expectations for companies that are very clearly set, or it should include that. And nowadays there are around 50 national action plans in around the world, more or less. New national action plans are being published recently. 4 countries have national action plans in the LAC region, all in continental Latin America. Argentina published it 2 weeks ago. Colombia has had a national action plan since 2015. They were the first ones. Chile has had national action plans since 2017. Both Colombia and Chile should be under revision now with the new governments in place. And Peru has published their national action plan in 2021. There are other sectorial policies that are connected to business and human rights. Some countries have, for example, policies for the mining and energy sector that have some human rights provision. So there are other ways to implement the guiding principles through government action. There are also NAPs, National Action Plans, under construction in Brazil, Ecuador, Mexico, and there are commitments from other states in continental Latin America to develop their national action plans. And of course, in Asia, in Africa, there are new developments. And so this is something in motion worldwide. In terms of regulatory developments, which is the other way, these are complement each other. We always say at the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights that stakeholders should put together a smart mix of measures. So different measures that kind of complement each other and can really protect human rights in the context of business activity and provide remedy. So it's not just national action plans. You can also have public policies regarding human rights and business. And definitely regulatory developments are very, very important, are one of the trends internationally nowadays. There are due diligence regulations in Europe that have an impact in Latin America and the Caribbean. France, Norway, the Netherlands, Germany have laws specifically on due diligence. Other states have laws that tackle one element, for example, modern slavery, child labor, etc. There is now in negotiation in the final stages a corporate sustainability due diligence directive at the EU. This will have an impact in the Caribbean region if you have commercial relationships with the EU, because it will require for suppliers of European companies to fulfill human rights due diligence and different steps to be able to be part of that supply chain. So this is very important to bear in mind, and that's why this is a very important agenda for the region. There are other directives on raw materials at the EU level, on zero deforestation. So for example, companies that are in the agricultural sector in the Caribbean and want to export or are part of the supply chain of European companies need to prove they are not contributing to deforestation. And this is already in place. So this poses, of course, some challenges, but also opportunities. And I think it's essential for you to be aware of this. And you'll need to work on this for sure. Japan, for example, has guidelines on respecting human rights and responsible supply chain and others. And I'll go quickly through the last one just to say and to close this part. That is the regulatory developments in the region. Of course, there are many things with regards to, for example, trade agreements. I just put here one from the US, Mexico, and Canada agreement that it's a forced labor import ban. So free trade agreements can also have certain elements that are, reflective of the guiding principles or protect human rights in the context of business and commercial activities. There are some proposals of human rights due diligence laws under consideration in some countries. There are other sectorial laws and regulations that are related to business and human rights. And of course, we have the Escazú Agreement. And I really want to bring this because it is an agreement that has had a lot of traction in the Caribbean. There are all those states that are state parties to the Escazú Agreement. There are some signatories pending ratification, but many countries in the Caribbean, many states have supported the Escazú Agreement. And the Escazú Agreement has some elements that really are in dialogue with the business and human rights agenda. And we, as part of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights, are engaging with the Escazú team and with the Escazú mechanisms to make sure there is an exchange there. Because the environment, and I think this is very important for the Caribbean states, given the fact that you are already heavily impacted by climate change and the climate crisis, and mitigation is essential, and adaptation. The right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, it's an international recognized human rights. And the UN guiding principles since 2022. So the UN guiding principles cover all internationally recognized human rights, which now includes the rights to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. And this is very important. Finally, there are some international instruments under dialogue, some treaties I'm not gonna stop there for the sake of time, but I think this is such an important agenda for this region. And I hope, the panel can also talk a little bit about that and why it is important for us to be having this dialogue and hopefully continue to work together in this context. Thank you very much.
Fernanda, thank you so much for this introduction to the Business and Human Rights Agenda, as well as is our first dialogue in the Caribbean. I think it's very important to recall on this framework and remember which are the obligations and responsibilities of every actor in this field. And especially, it helps to us to open to our multi-stakeholder dialogue right now, where we have a very special guest who have a deep experience on business and human rights agenda and are here today to share their acknowledgement. Before to introduce them, I would like to remember that we have a Q&A chat where you can leave all your questions for the panelists, and we will have the opportunity to answer them at the end of the panel. So thank you to everyone who already shared their questions, and please feel free to share all your comments in the chat. I named it before, sorry. So now I would like to introduce to our panelists. First, Dr. Axel Kravatsky, who is the chairman and principal consultant at Syntegra Change Architects Limited. It's a former lecturer in economics at the University of the West Indies, where he co-founded the Sustainable Economic Development Unit. He has worked with private and public sectors, and his specialties are the financial, state-owned enterprises, utilities, SME, small and medium enterprises, and not-for-profit sectors. Axel was the founding chairman of the Caribbean Corporate Governance Institute, and since the 2017, the co-convener and editor of ISO TC 309 WG1, developing the new foundational standards ISO 37000 guidance of the governance of organizations. He's also a member of the European Corporate Governance Institute and the president of the European Business Chamber in Trinidad and Tobago. We also have Ashley Lashley, UNICEF Youth Advocate, CARICOM Youth Ambassador, and the Executive Director of the Ashley Lashley Foundation and the Hay Campaign. Dr. Deborah Benjamin also joined us today. She's an operation management professional with more than 15 years management experience working with global brands in regional Caribbean markets, with focus on international supplier relationships to support sales, marketing, retail, and supply chain segments. She holds various board positions, such as Director of AMCHAM, Suriname, and Director at ISC2 Caribbean Chapter. Finally, we will have Dr. Alison Gajadar. He is the Managing Director of KMA Consulting Limited, St. Lucia. She has collaborated with international and regional organizations to help governments address quality infrastructural issues and technical regulatory frameworks. Dr. Gajadar further served as the National Representative for ISO TC 309, Governance of Organizations, and ISO TC 262, Risk Management, as well as the Member Representative for ISO TC 176, Quality Management and Quality Assurance. So welcome to all of our panelists. Remember that we will have our first round of questions and you will have 5 minutes to answer. Well, I will go first with Dr. Alex Kravatsky. I would like, just let me.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Doctor. Welcome.
Thank you for the opportunity.
I would like to ask you, the first question for you is, what work are you doing which can assist governments in moving forward with the implementation of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights? Thank you.
Right. So I think it is in 3 ways. So in one way, being the president for the European Business Chamber in Trinidad and Tobago, we are focusing on sustainability as opposed to a more narrow focus, which everybody is now also talking about, which is ESG. But most of the ESG, particularly the type of ESG that will become probably mandatory using the IFRS, the International Sustainability Standards Board's disclosure framework, will be focusing on the risks to the enterprise and not the impact of the enterprise on its context. So by focusing on the context, we are directly seeking to support also the UN the guiding principles of human rights in business. So that is one dimension, and I'll speak a little bit more about that. But the second dimension is maybe a little bit even more general, which is that of governance. So in the governance area, there are two particular areas that are particularly relevant right now. The first one is that the Caribbean has been very active. So in particular, St. Lucia, Jamaica, and Trinidad and Tobago in leading the development of the international standards in the field of organizations. So that is the whole 37,000 series. And that includes the now consensus standard on what governance means and governance for sustainable development, integrated governance for sustainable development, where the purpose of the organization and its impact on people and planet are at the center of governance, which very much is in line with the UN guiding principles. But more than that, there are also some 3 published standards which are now adopted as national standards in many jurisdictions within the Caribbean, which is 37,001, which is on anti-bribery, 37,002, which is on whistleblowing, and there is 37,301, which is compliance management systems. And so having a rigorous certifiable system through which you can actually assure yourself and others that you are able to act on your responsibilities and your obligations is something very useful and important. But even more specifically, at present, in the working group PC 309, where I'm the vice chair and leading the work on governance, which is 2 additional standards. But the one I want to mention is 37,200, which is guidance for the prevention, identification, and response to human trafficking, forced labor, and modern slavery. So this standard now then complements and gives direct management systems guidance for how organizations can assure themselves and others that they're doing all that is necessary and all that is expected. So one area, therefore, is governance and specifically standard development. The second big area, I think, has to do with sustainability, where in the Caribbean, the Global Reporting Initiative is probably currently the internationally most used reporting framework relating to sustainability, which would encompass many of the topics that have been mentioned. But that is now being complemented by the more recent SDG impact standards, which is not a reporting framework, but a decision-making framework that enables organizations to integrate sustainable development goals into their management and governance activities so that they can maximize their positive impact and limit and avoid negative ones, which the ESG frameworks wouldn't do because you're only looking for those specific points that are identified rather than looking at all your impacts. And it is not, the ESG frameworks are not meant to inform or increase the value generation, but ensure that no harm is being done and that you're aware of what other impacts you're having in the case of the European version of it. And finally, in the private business sector, so for example, at Eurocham, we are supporting sustainability, having introduced also, for example, the Sustainability Champion Initiative, in which we're helping organizations to benchmark themselves. We provide training and public recognition for their efforts in championing sustainability. And I think these kind of initiatives then are complementing the other efforts within the region, and we very much welcome the dialogue and are keen to be part of it. Does that give you a long answer to your straight question?
It's okay, Dr. Kravatsky. Thank you so much. Indeed, all these processes that you named and regulations have gradually been aligned with UNGPs in the language of human rights, which is a very positive for the region and for all the companies who are joining these efforts. So thank you so much. I will be back with you later. So now we have Ashley Lashley, welcome. And we have a question for you. From your perspective, what are the most salient impacts of the business sector on the rights of children, adolescents, and other affected populations in the Caribbean? Thank you.
Thank you, Joanna. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. And thank you for asking me that question, especially as a UNICEF youth advocate, because I believe that it's important to delve into this topic that is not just about the business sector, it's about children's rights, it's about adolescents and the most vulnerable people across Latin America and the Caribbean. As a young person, I've seen that responsible businesses are doing some good stuff, driving growth, creating jobs, and sparking innovation. And it's a big but, in my opinion, that we've got to talk and address the not so great stuff. The impact of certain businesses moves on our most vulnerable people. And I heard it mentioned at the beginning of the opening about child labor, which is a major issue and is a flat out violation of children's rights. Imagine this, people. Children stuck in hazardous conditions, forced into labor and missing out on school. That is not cool. That is not the future in which we want our children to inherit. We need to step up and kick these practices to the curb, making sure that our supply chains are child exploitation-free zones. And I believe that is crucial to recognize that the impact of business activities goes way beyond child labor. Our focus must extend to a broader spectrum, acknowledging how children are affected by these conditions of their working parents and even their caregivers. So for me, it is imperative to shed light on the importance of advocating for family-friendly policies within the workplace. And I believe that promoting family-friendly policies is not just about compliance, it's about committing to fostering a holistic environment that nurtures the well-being of children, families, and interestingly enough, the companies themselves. And I believe that these policies should encompass variant aspects such as best breastfeeding support, parental leave, child benefits, and access to early childhood development services. Family-friendly policies are a cornerstone for creating a workplace that prioritizes the welfare of all individuals involved. And by ensuring adequate support for parents, I personally believe that we can contribute to a more conducive environment where families can thrive and children can experience a nurturing environment even when parents are at work. But it's important that I emphasize that these policies are not exclusive to specific industries, but are applicable to all economic sectors present in the Caribbean, whether it be manufacturing sectors or any other sector. Implementing and promoting these decent work policies is, in my opinion, an investment in the overall well-being of our society. And recently, I've been reading different articles and studies on this. It has shown that consistently within the workplace with supportive policies, witness improved levels of productivity, enhance employee satisfaction, and an increase in retention rates. So for me, it is a win-win situation where businesses flourish and employees, including parents, really feel valued and supported. But outside of that, we know and we have been seeing that businesses can leave a big mess that messes with our health and with our children's future. From pollution and deforestation, it messes up our ecosystems and it messes with the rights to our access to healthy environments. And a quick fact, I'm not sure if you guys knew, but UNICEF recently released a report that indicated that children and teens get hit the hardest by climate change. But hard to get and say what happens. And in our region, Latin America and the Caribbean, millions of young ones, children and youth face environmental shocks every year. And this is not the future that we want for our kids. But to continue to answer your question, Joanna, additionally, I believe that some businesses moves make it tough for kids, young people in general, to really grab onto opportunities. There's still too many unpaid internships present today. And I mean, yes, it's still a thing, and so many young persons who have met are appreciative of the chance to be employed within the workforce, but at the end of the day, they still have bills to pay. And climbing the career ladder, it's like climbing a mountain, especially when the older crew hog on to all of the managerial positions within the workforce. But I believe that more businesses are waking up to their responsibilities. Ethical and sustainable practices are getting some spotlight, and that's why we're here today. And it's not just about their reputation, it's about a legit commitment to respecting human rights. Teamwork between businesses, governments, and folks on the ground is what is going to, in my opinion, make a world where money making and human rights go hand in hand. So thank you.
Thank you so much to you, Ashley. There is no doubt that the specific focus on the protection of children and adolescents is fundamental, and that we need to work actively on it. And I just would like to highlight what you mentioned about the inclusion of the families in these policies as the nucleus that can effectively protect children. There is a lot of work to be done, but I think that this is a special thing that I would like to remark. Now, I would like to pass with Deborah Benjamin. Deborah, if you're there, we would like you can answer the question, how is the private sector realizing their efforts to respect human rights, and what are the incentives that they have to do it? So Deborah, thank you so much.
Hi, Joanna, yes, and all the panelists, thank you again for inviting me and giving the opportunity for us to speak from the business perspective on this issue, because I do believe, as Fernanda had outlined, I mean, there's a very robust framework in place already. It is just motivating and expediting the operationalizing and the executing of this across the business sector. Alex also would have alluded to a lot of the standards and the international developments that would have impact on the LAC region. And effectively, companies, have the power to positively impact lives of individuals by doing the basic human rights in terms of providing fair wages, safe working conditions, preventing child labor, as Ashley alluded to as well. And there's a lot of modernization of that under guise of, as Ashley really referred to just now, internships, unpaid internships. And, long ago, there was a culture of, if you want to get experience, you work for free and gain the experience. But nowadays, as she said, there are bills to pay, and economies have become a lot harder. And people have to be recognized for the value that they bring, even if they are gaining experience at the same time. So some of those things are disguised as internships and under the benefit of trying to give people experience, but there is some real exploitation behind some of it as well. I can speak on behalf of my experience with multinational companies, the company I'm currently with, as well as previous multinational enterprises that I've been involved with in the region, both on the energy side, on the manufacturing and distribution side as well. And that has largely contributed to a lot of what I think is coming into the region, because headquarters are usually in the UK or Europe or US. These are companies that would have signed on to many of the standards that would advance human rights and a lot of the UN goals that form a lot of the international developments that are impacting the Caribbean region now. And I think the international companies lead the charge on this discussion, because we have it enshrined in a lot of our policies, our procedures. We have it operationalized in our business. And this comes in the form of ensuring HR due diligence, which Fernando would have referred to previously, and all that goes with that. It is also implemented and executed in operations and supply chains through ethical sourcing. So, we speak about ethical sourcing when it comes to goods, but there's ethical sourcing when it comes to labor as well. And understanding the steps that are involved in ensuring that the labor is also ethically and sourced. It prevents the harm, it prevents the discrimination, it prevents the exploitation of not only children, but refugees, migrant labor. Those things are coming to the fore more and more these days. And the other things that Alex alluded to would have been policies like the anti-bribery, whistleblowing policies, mechanisms to prevent forced labor and modern slavery, and of course, sustainability. Those are things that are already enshrined in many of the multinational companies as we, do business with our clients, with our customers, with our subcontractors, in terms of advancing the discussion, advancing how this will, be implemented with other companies, because that really is the goal that that the working group is after. How do we expand on this and make it more prevalent with other companies? A lot of what has worked is that when multinationals impose these requirements on suppliers, on subcontractors, on other service companies that do business with them, it requires those companies to improve the framework that they have. So, for example, we will have suppliers doing business with us that when you tender for work, if you don't have these things in place, you don't meet the baseline for being able to submit a proposal for the work. And similarly, we now will pass that on through our supply chain to say you are expected to have anti-bribery policies in place, whistleblowing policies in place, promote the prevention of modern slavery and child labor. And then, of course, as Alex alluded to, the most recent KPI that is on a lot of the multinational companies, the sustainability goals. So we have our sustainability plans with our goals as a 2040 as a target for net zero. And those are things that we have to show that we are actively executing on. We report on them on a quarterly and an annual basis. And we have to present reports like that also to other companies when we tender for business. So it is not just talking the talk, it's walking the walk, because you have to show that you are actually executing on it. You have to track it, because in tracking it is where you recognize if there's a gap, if you're behind your target, if you're ahead of your target. And when we take these things that we are actively executing and impose it on other companies that we do business with, that is how I think you start and you support the advancement of it with other companies and other service providers. So I do think there is a responsibility on the companies that have headquarters in the UK and Europe and so on, and are familiar with these laws and have embraced them already and implemented them in helping the other companies in the region, in the Caribbean region, to improve and raise the level of standard that we all operate on, because at the end of the day, it is bringing that standard to our own region here, so that we are able now to, level the playing field and ensure that, we improve the lives of all the citizens that live in our local communities.
Deborah, thank you so much for sharing your experience from the private sector in how to raise standards in the Caribbean through a supply chain, for example. And it is true that we already have 10 years of the UNDPs, for example, and even other previous standards, and that it seems too long time to do it well, but it is certainly an agenda that continues to mature and strengthen. So we hope we can support all these efforts, and we'll be back again with you to other questions. So thank you so much, Deborah. Well, now I would like to go with Dr. Alison Gajador. Thank you so much for your participation, and I would like you to answer the question about how can governments strengthen their legal, policy, and institutional frameworks to protect human rights in the context of business activities? Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks, Joanna. I will be speaking from the quality infrastructure perspective. The UN system has recognized standardization as a key component for quality infrastructures within all jurisdictions, all member states. Quality infrastructure includes not only standardization, but conformity assessment related activities to provide assurance to the trade business consumers, trading parties, that each party is complying to best practices. It includes systems of metrology, assurance with respect to verification of measurements, and accreditation, a whole host of matters. So conformity assessment includes certification, auditing, etc. But let's focus on the standardization area. Now, under this system, the ISO is recognized as the international standard setting body. ISO's target users, however, are slightly different from the broader UN system. So the ISO's target users are the operators, the organizations. So they set standards and guidance documents not to for the benefit or the users of the government, but rather for the benefit of individual organizations, business operators, to implement processes and systems that are coherent with the same guiding principles that have been espoused by the various UN bodies. And so ISO has, so when we speak of these international standards under the ISO system, we are speaking of standards that are legitimately recognized through the global trading system, the WTO, under agreements like technical barriers to trade agreements, SPS agreements that are accepted as consensus-based documents, that if businesses use these guidance documents, impediments to trade with one another would be minimized or eliminated. And so you would see immediately why through the ISO network, it is a wonderful forum through which you target businesses to promote human rights. And it's not only through the standards and the guidance documents, but it's even the mechanism, the how these standards are developed. So because these standards are consensus-based and they are recognized by governments to be generally accepted best practices, the development process is very much detailed. The technical committees involves not just government representatives from international governmental organizations and national government organizations, but also technical experts and businesses themselves. So for instance, on many of those committees as well, because I do a lot of work, I wear two hats. The one side assisting governments with the quality infrastructure aspect, but on the other side, because I work a lot with the MSME sector, which the majority of which comprise our business sector in the CARICOM region, CARICOM and Latin America, sitting on those technical committees on the developmental aspect stages ensures that the views of our business sectors are expressed and heard and considered in these documents. And for this, I say, here you have, and Juliet touched on it, a perfect point to pivot from, which you can speak to, reach out to our operators of all sizes, business organizations. So in a nutshell, I'm not sure if I have expressed sharply how the work of governments through promoting standardization and robust quality infrastructure systems can provide the backbone which will support our businesses within the MSC sector more so than the big corporate sectors that could hire the consultants and the expense third-party verification systems of assurance, but more so governments utilizing the quality infrastructure mechanisms can support our MSC sector to implement these standards that or many speakers before me have spoken about, which are targeted to assist our small businesses to withhold the principles of business ethics and human rights.
Alison, thank you. Thank you so much for your reflection. And of course, it's pretty important to have in count all the sectors, independent of the size of the enterprises, into this conversation, even if it's about the obligation of the states. They have to make an open conversation with all these sectors, and so we can hopefully expect that these policies will be effectively because they have in count all their particularities in their context. So thank you so much, Alison, for sharing. So now I would like to go back to Ashley. Ashley, if you can help us to answer this question on like a final question, how have young people in affected populations participated in the business and human rights agenda in the Caribbean? You maybe already made some highlights about it, but specifically, how should this participation be strengthened in the future in the Caribbean region? Please, Ashley, thank you.
No, thank you. Well, I firstly want to highlight the transformative impact that young people have had in shaping the discourse on business and human rights. And in recent years, I know we have seen that youth-led movements have surged, demanded accountability, transparency, and ethical practices from businesses globally. And oftentimes we have seen that the voices of young people have been amplified through mediums such as social media that have brought attention to the responsibility that businesses bear in upholding human rights, especially environmental rights. And I've even seen that because I'm currently in Dubai here at COP28, which concluded yesterday, how our young people continue to stand up for what we believe is right and demanded the necessary accountability from our leaders. But I think that is crucial to recognize the role of affected populations in shaping the business and human rights agenda. Firstly, communities impacted by environmental degradation, workers facing labor rights violations, and as mentioned previously, indigenous populations that are defending their land rights really have a pivotal role in exposing the human rights implications of business activities. And while there have been progress, there's still, in my opinion, lots of work to be done to ensure that these voices are actively incorporated in decision-making processes. And here, well, I'm from Barbados, and in Barbados, initiatives like the Wilding Green Business Project, which is a project that is in collaboration with the Barbados Chamber of Commerce and the Ashley Foundation, it really looked at involving youth as environmental auditors and environmental assessors to analyze the sustainability of the business sector, working in conjunction, creating that multi-sectorial approach to ensuring transparency around the notions of sustainability within the business sector. But the participation gap still persists, and urgent action is needed to include adolescents and youth in these debates and policy development more in the Caribbean. And my involvement even recently in a presenting study by UNICEF and the Gina Davis Institute really revealed that harmful gender norms in advertising in Mexico and the Caribbean. And these studies have highlighted the potential risk factors associated with violence against women and girls. And just recently, we would have concluded 16 days of activism, really emphasizing the need for a more inclusive and just portrayal of gender in advertising, and to really strengthen the participation of young people and affected populations. We must create, I would say, an inclusive space for dialogue that prioritizes education and awareness, and really leveraging technology for outreach and mobilization. And there must be genuine partnerships between businesses and those affected by their operations are essential to really fostering a movement where business and human rights are mutually reinforced in the principles. So to conclude, to your question, there needs to be an active level of participation by young people and affected populations. And by doing this, we would really see a testament to their resilience and a driving force for positive change by, again, creating inclusive spaces, fostering education, and really leveraging technology where we can empower the next generation. Thank you.
Ashley, thank you so much. And thank you so much for the time you took to answer this question. And finally, I would like to go back to Deborah. Deborah, you have already told us previously how there are already advances in the implementation of human rights due diligence and how the standards have helped to increase these actions. But from your perspective, to what extent do companies apply human rights due diligence processes? And especially, what difficulties do they encounter from your perspective? Thank you.
Thank you, Joanna. So yes, the HR due diligence is a big part of the implementation of these policies. And what we want to ensure that we do is, ensure that we comply definitely with prevention of child labor. So we ensure that anybody we hire, anybody we recruit meets the minimum legal age for hiring. We ensure that our subcontractors and any service companies that we do business with sign on to these policies as well and confirm that their employees, not only the ones that will be assigned to our work and our contracts, but generally that the company has signed on to these policies of preventing child labor and other modern slavery practices. We also ensure that as part of screening practices that we put our service companies and subcontractors under the scrutiny of making sure that they do not take advantage of and exploit migrant labor. And that could be legal migrant labor, or it could be refugees as well, which we know is becoming more and more of a factor in these times. So diplomatically, those are questions and extra scrutiny that we would put on companies that we work with as well. Culturally, those culturally would be a factor that we would face as a challenge, because typically companies in the region, smaller companies, would employ persons without work permits. They would employ refugees to get the benefit of persons working for a lower wage and things like that. So that is why we adopt a lot of these strict screening processes, so that it helps in advancing the agenda and it helps with stopping those types of practices if you want to work in our space. Other challenges would be things like if there is no specific legislation in place that that we can fall back on, because then companies will say, well, it's not regulated, so why are you demanding it of us? And then yesterday, as I was preparing to come on the panel, I also got a different side of an opinion from some legal minds that also raised some specific issues around human rights in the legal space, around the impacts and the definitions of a worker and an employee as it regards industrial relations and rights to fair hearings. So for example, in Trinidad, we have an industrial court, and a worker or somebody who's classified as a worker has access through the industrial court via the process of the unions and so forth. However, somebody who's classified as an employee will not have access and will have to take it to high court, where the decision is usually on the basis of a contract law, as opposed to human rights in terms of being able to get a fair hearing, being able to have a just review, being able to give your side of the story. Those things are not necessarily applicable to a person that's classified as an employee versus a worker. And I think from that perspective as well is where business and industry face a challenge with workers, because that tends to be viewed in some spaces as a fundamental human right that is denied to working persons. So that's a different aspect of it that I would say is a challenge right now. And we do have an advanced framework for workers and workers' rights in Trinidad, but that is one of the things that is in the space creating challenges as far as human rights are concerned in that perspective.
All right, Dora, thank you so much. Well, finally, I would like to ask to Dr. Kravatsky, Dr. Gajadar, and Ashley, and of course, Deborah, if you would like to share some reflections from this first dialogue. How do you think a movement of public, private, and civil society actors can be created to promote respect for human rights in business in 2024? And which actors do you consider key to be part of this movement in the Caribbean? So please just take like 2 minutes for everyone. Who would like to go first?
Okay, I can go. You know, so I think it needs to be a differentiator. So in one way, it needs to be joined up, and on the other hand, it needs to be differentiated. So I think the joined up part needs to be because it's a multifaceted, interdependent issue, and there are many who want to contribute, and partly they create confusion by having too many things that are unclear to the potential user. So differentiated, I think, needs to be, I think there are 4 groups of differentiation. So the first one is there's a group of companies and other organizations, but let's say companies that are simply unethical and unaware. I mean, they literally don't care and they don't know. They are just, let's say, cowboys. Then you have the enlightened companies who say, okay, I get it. More ethical, more responsible, actually can link to profits. And but they say, okay, well, show me the profit. Show me exactly what I need to do in order to increase the profit. And then, but they're focused on themselves. And then the third aspect, the third group of companies are companies that want to contribute to sustainable development. And for them, the question is, okay, no, I get it, but show me how to do more of it better and join up in a collective effort. And the fourth categorization is between small and medium or large. And I think that the offering needs to be differentiated and needs to be communicated in a differentiated ways. Because the large ones have a lot to contribute and a lot of extra potential if they actually integrate sustainability as a target and as a responsibility in exactly the same way as they use finance for their measurement and management. So I think that simply through regulation, it's impossible. It will just become a nightmare of regulations and it will not succeed. It will just be a leaking bucket with more regulations. But there needs to be regulation. At the same time, also focusing the very essence of business, which is to create solutions to the people of meaningful problems of people and planet. So if they actually do that, then there's much more alignment, and only in that way can we actually save capitalism.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Kravatsky. And now, I don't know, Ashley, you would like to share some?
Yeah, I can go. I think that there are many actors that would play a role, well, key players that will play a role in this. For instance, civil society organizations, government agencies, academic institutions. International collaboration is also important. But as previously heard, persons have also touched on indigenous and marginalized communities who are at the forefront of this discussion. But I guess I can stick on civil society organizations, especially representing one, and their advocacy efforts and work and community engagements is where we would continue to hold businesses accountable, making them essential contributors to the conversation. And what we really need is to see the strengthening of their capacity and facilitating various civil society groups that would help with their overall collective impacts. And local businesses, both large corporations and small enterprises, are crucial actors in this discussion. And even when we look at public awareness campaigns are also key. And in the region where we know tourism is a significant industry, in my opinion, educating both local and visitors are ethical business practices that we can create in demand for businesses that prioritize human rights. And basically what I'm saying is that a successful movement in the Caribbean region involves collaboration amongst youth, civil society, businesses, government entities, and international partners to really create that multi-sectorial approach that we would have heard to really foster inclusivity, encouraging and engaging dialogue, and addressing the specific needs to diverse communities where we can build a movement that resonates well with the values of human rights and ethical business practices.
Great, Ashley. Thank you so much. Now, Dr. Gadjadar, would you like to share some reflections on this question?
Yes, thanks,
Thank you.
Joanna. I think for 2024, definitely the major part of it, the first part of the year, has to focus quite a bit on the raising the awareness and touching the hearts of our two key sectors. One, highest policy making level within our governments, our executives, to have that conversation and awareness of business ethics and the importance of business considerations of business ethics, which includes, among many other things, human rights issues. Because one, in our part of the world, the governments are the largest procurement bodies, almost the largest in most of the member states. And so they are aware of the human rights issues, corruption issues, more from the regulatory standpoint, from the big watchdog OECD consequences of access to financing, and perhaps not embracing it in a manner that will encourage the MSC sector that they try to engage with and deal with from the perspective of this being beneficial for the sustainability of the business. So let's target our highest policy makers in all our CARICOM member states. And of course, it was said by many of the speakers before, raising the awareness within our business sector that it's not about a compliance issue. Axel, I think he crystallized the 4 different types of users or recipients of this message we want to spread into these 4 categories. Let's design the messages to suit each of them. But for sure, one thing that's common, whether or not you're nonprofits, whatever type of business activity you're in, you want to ensure your sustainability, viability over time. So I think that is the type of conversation, not from the regulatory big dog, watchdog aspect, where the topic has been introduced largely as requirements or checkboxing, but engaging with them on a deeper level, all these sectors. Thanks.
Great, Dr. Gadjadar, thank you so much. And Deborah, finally, and to ensure that we will have the time to ask other questions, I would like to ask you if you can answer this question with 2 and 3 minutes. Thank you so much.
Yes, Joanna. So just to sum up, because Ashley, Alison, and Alex basically indicated all the points that I would have raised. Sensitization, education definitely is going to be a big part of it, because making everybody aware of the requirement that we need to sign on to promote these policies. Legislation, definitely, as a means of enforcement. I know Alison said it shouldn't be from a compliance big dog factor, but that has to be part of the conversation as well. So I think approaching it from a perspective of it's not one brush that paints everybody, but maybe a tiered approach in terms of, largest companies and those that are micro and small fall into different categories that they are required to start embracing these policies by, because obviously a lot of it has much to do with the ability, to put these things in place. Finances and the ability, the wherewithal to do things like that will impact a large company different to a micro and a small enterprise company. So I think using that approach and engaging companies from that perspective is also important, because you recognize that you cannot paint everybody with a broad brush. But then finally, from the company perspective, if you want to stand out as a responsible company and promote that you have responsible business practices, you don't necessarily have to wait on legislation. So in many cases, larger companies will enforce practices to do with industrial relations, practices to do with HSC and OHCHR practices, not as a standard, but we exceed many of these minimums that are already in place. So you shouldn't necessarily have to wait on legislation before you adopt a practice or a policy. So as a responsible company, leading the way, leading by example, by having all of these policies executed in your organization and making sure that they are implemented along your supply chain as well, are also ways that we can advance the conversation going forward. And yes, government, yes, private companies, but also the other organizations that support business. So like the chambers and those sorts of groups that can disseminate information amongst their members and advocate for the implementation of these practices and use best practice as examples, because there are companies that have done it, that are starting to do it, and support them in ways that make it easier for companies to sign on. Don't leave them alone out there and telling them you have to do it, but have a supportive environment where you help them along with the writing of the policies that are specific to their industry and the work that they do and things like that. So a lot of these other bodies can help in advancing the agenda.
Deborah, thank you so much. And thank you so much again to Dr. Kravatsky, Dr. Gadjadar, Ashley, for all your reflection and for sharing your experience in this agenda. And also, I would like to thank you to the representatives of CARICOM for their participation in the session as well. I would like to hear the reflection as well, if it's possible. We have Brian Belovo and Sherwin Stephenson. I don't know if you would like to share some reflection about how, based on the discussions had during this event, how do you see CARICOM's role in promoting the UNGP at the regional level, as well as we have to speak about how regulation are important, but maybe it's not the first step that we have to take, or how the states who can join these efforts and, of course, move forward into their obligations in human rights. I don't know if maybe we have any of you here.
Good morning, all. Brian Bilby here. Sorry, my camera is not available at this point in time. Unfortunately, for us, this is an issue which we very much have to work with our respective member states and the various private sector or organizations. But this is an issue which would be essentially driven by our respective member states, and from our point of view as a secretariat, it is something that where we could assist in terms of coordinating developments, in so that we have more of a regional response, and that we can hopefully pull the region along together at hopefully a same pace. Because one of the challenges is that legislation is always going to be or implementing legislation is always a challenge within the region in terms of the drafting, in terms of its implementation. But it is something, from my personal perspective, it's not a area which is of my particular area of expertise, but I found the discussion very, very useful, informative, and it is definitely something which I will definitely bring back to my other colleagues within the Secretariat and to see how we can actually assist member states in taking this matter forward. Thank you.
Brian, thank you so much for your reflections. And well, I don't know if maybe we have Sherwin online, but we don't see her. But Brian, thank you so much. And now we are going to have the space to resolve from some of the questions that we have on the chat. And they are linked to this special issue because some of them are linked to how the state can promote the strengthening of the reparation of the judicial mechanism. So I would like to read some of these questions. I think that the best way to do it, because we have a short time, is I will read all the questions here, and every one of you in the panel, you can pick which one of them you would like to answer. And if you want to answer more than one or whatever you wanted. So I will go with the first question. So how do you resolve human rights issues when the rights clash and contradict each other? I guess here we are talking about a case where more than 2 human rights are just clashing. And how do you resolve this case? And I don't know if from the business perspective, but we can do it from any of your expertise. Also, we have the question, how far has the Caribbean region advanced in regulations recognizing the linkages between the obligation to remedy and the protection of the environment? Are there a specific example of states that have adopted innovative regulation to incorporate environmental impact assessments that take into account the rights of local communities and peoples? We have a third question. I don't see the value of the forum if this is going to be exclusive a seminar with no clear or active participation from the public or the actor. Reflection are made from a general standpoint and not to indicate clear commitments or ways forward to take the conversation to another level. Thank you so much for this reflection. We would like to take it in count. This is our first dialogue, so we hope that we can do it better in the next session. And of course, we would like to hear some reflection from the panel as a first step to open this dialogue. But now we would like you to share all your comments and your questions below so we can have the chance to answer them. Thank you so much. I don't know. I have another question, I guess. Maybe about the Colombian case. I remember something.
No, but Colombia is not included in the context of this dialogue, so I dismissed it. Sorry.
All right. Thank you so much. So we have these first questions that I share with you. I don't know if you would like to share some. The first one about the human rights clashing between each other, and how far the Caribbean region has advanced in regulations between remedy and the protection of the environment. So Dr. Kravatsky, please.
Yeah, so let's say on the first question about the potential clash, which I don't know, it's an abstract question, so the answer is going to be suitably abstract. But the first of all, in business and all forms of organizations and decision making, there are usually multiple objectives. Now, when it comes to rights, it seems to be like a pretty sort of absolute thing. And if I need to be in business by violating human rights, maybe I need to be in a different kind of business, because I would never find it acceptable to violate any form of basic human right. But the generic solution is not to trade off one against the other and to say, well, I only take one and I completely abandon the other, but to find a way to resolve this dilemma by understanding the extremes of the dilemma and how I can use that in order to create a solution that is better overall. So it is really working through dilemmas, and dialogue is one of those dimensions where when people come together and understand the different perspectives and engage with the stakeholders who are experiencing the actions of your organization, and you understand what they value, how much they value it, what they and how they perceive the trade-offs, and engage with them as part of the solving of the issue, I guarantee you will come up with very creative and very innovative solutions that increase the value overall.
Thank you, Dr. Kravatsky. I don't know if someone else would like to share some reflections on these questions.
Joanna,
Thank you, Laura.
absolutely in support with Axel on this. If you are in business and you feel that you have to violate human rights, you're in the wrong business. So I think that is how you'd make a decision, right? What's best for the community, what's best for the people that work for you, and so on. Because those things would definitely outweigh any other factor of business going forward if you have a clash. And then it really shouldn't be a clash either, because if you are adopting the right principles, then it's impossible to have a clash with your business principles. So by adopting the principles, it's supposed to be in line with your commitment as a corporate, as a responsible company. In terms of the other question, in the protection of the environment, I think we're getting there with a lot of legislation on environmental impact assessments and things like that, and approvals that are required for certain types of buildings and so on. But I think we have far to go in terms of responsibility where it comes to preventing spills and pollution and things like that in the environment. And I think the enforcement is also a big part of that. So there are regulations, but the enforcement piece is not as strong as it should be in terms of penalties and holding persons accountable, holding companies accountable, where there is legislation, even though it may need some more teeth, but the existing legislation is not, I think, strongly enforced as is. So there's some work to be done there. And then in terms of rights of local communities and peoples, and I think from my space, I can speak on the perspective of supporting and advocating for local content. And I know that's becoming a stronger theme in the region these days. I think Guyana has definitely put that as a focus on the map, and Suriname is very close behind. We've had the conversation in Trinidad previously, but I think not at the strong level that a Guyana or Suriname would have brought it on board based on their recent developments in oil and gas and so forth. So I think definitely the piece on local content is strong and can be developed with the company's perspectives, because I firmly believe that local content and local capability are two different definitions. And we have to ensure that if we are promoting local content, we ensure that we pull the capability of people and our communities along with it, and not just say local, but how am I impacting the local communities as a result? How am I developing persons in the long run with skills that are transferable from industry to industry or from place to place, whatever the sector may be, right? And it's not just that I am forming a business locally or I am conducting business locally, but how am I truly enabling the communities and the people who will remain thereafter if your sector or your business is no longer there? What impact am I leaving to help them go on to continue living productively, and the ability for them to transfer skills to something else if I, as a company or a sector or an industry, are no longer in the picture in that particular country? And I think that comes with responsible companies as well. So that's my 2 cents on that.
Great, Deborah, thank you so much. Because we have another interest questions. I would like to add these questions to the panel, and of course, Fernanda Hoppenheim also would like to answer some of them, but before I would like to read some of them. First of one is, who is in charge of the regulation of small and medium enterprises to respect or not impact negative the human rights? Also, do you think the Latin America country need due diligence on human rights acts instead than national action plans on business and human rights? And the final is, what challenges do you currently see in relation to effects of the global climate crisis in the Caribbean that can be addressed in this agenda? For example, flooding of Iceland, extreme heat, and pollution of the sea. So I don't know if, for example, Dr. Galladar or Ashley would like to share some reflections. If no, we can go to Fernanda Hoppenheim to answer some of them. Great. So, well, Fernanda, you have the floor now.
Thank you so much, Joanna, and thank you for this great panel, colleagues. It was really exciting to hear all your interventions, and also thank you to the audience for their questions. Of course, this is the first of many, hopefully, spaces for engagement and exchange. So we will continue having these dialogues, and hopefully they can develop into, you know, different concrete commitments and pathways forward. So there is a question, and you know, this dialogue is concentrated on the Caribbean that asks whether, you know, Latin American countries, I would say Caribbean countries in this context, need due diligence on human rights acts instead of national action plans. Well, as I was saying during my presentation, those are not necessarily contradictory, you know, strategies. Of course, all states need different types of instruments and types of measures to protect human rights in the context of business activities and to set out clear expectations for companies and clear requirements for companies. So, of course, national action plans are important as they set out, again, the actions the states will take. They are not an action in itself, they're a plan for action, right? So then concrete action needs to happen on the ground. And that includes developing legislation as needed. That depends on the states and the type of legal framework and requirements for companies, etc., that states have, and what they identify as gaps in, for example, the national action plans, or when they do what we call national baseline assessments, so kind of a diagnosis of the state of play of business and human rights and what's needed to fill those gaps. So, of course, some countries need due diligence laws. I do think, I'm convinced that all states should consider a mix of measures, public policy, national action plans, and legislation. So yes, the working group supports the development of legislations in different countries, again, backed with an analysis of what's needed in a certain context, right? And what gaps need to be filled. Then on SMEs, or small, medium, and also micro enterprises, the state is the one that needs to regulate all companies, right? The state has the duty to protect human rights. What it requires to SMEs, in contrast with what it requires to larger companies, can vary. Some states have, for example, these due diligence laws or directives that cover larger companies, right? And then they work on specific policies for smaller companies, again, because the reality is different. There is also an important role to be played by business associations or chambers or different type of trade associations. There are many associations that are mostly composed by SMEs, and they can, for example, provide capacity building, help desks, etc., for SMEs to kind of increase their awareness on these issues and start to develop certain measures and policies. So there's definitely a lot of work to be done focusing on SMEs, as well as all the work to be done focusing on larger companies. And I mean, there is a question on climate change and the climate crisis. And of course, our colleagues that actually live in the Caribbean can definitely talk more to that. But we see it as, of course, a pressing issue for the Caribbean states, for all island states, for that matter. It is definitely intertwined with the business and human rights agenda. There are things that emissions to the environment, pollution, you know, of the sea, and loss of biodiversity, all of those elements, companies can contribute to increasing that crisis, or if they conduct their business responsibly and with human rights and environmental due diligence, to prevent that this crisis increases. So there's definitely some crossing, some overlapping between all the actions to fight the climate crisis and address the climate crisis and what businesses should be doing with regards to human rights, including environmental rights. So there's definitely an overlap there. And I think this is probably one of the drivers in the Caribbean to advance this agenda. You know, this crisis that is really hitting on you. Also, many states are deeply in debt. And these are the things that we should be talking about when we talk about business and human rights in the Caribbean. When we talk about business and human rights in certain regions, sub-regions, or states, we talk about it in the context of what's happening. It's not in a vacuum. It's not an ideal type of adoption and implementation of the guiding principles, but actually an implementation that it's rooted in the context of that particular region and those particular states. And that's why I think addressing the climate crisis with a human rights and business lens, it's a huge opportunity to advance this agenda. Thank you.
And Joanna, to add to Fernanda's thoughts, just to say that indeed a legislative response is not mutually exclusive with developing a plan, but rather both are needed. And if one has to go in order of priority, you would have the policy level set by the government to address these issues, out of which you have your strategic priorities and your action plan, which will include, of course, addressing, strengthening the regulatory approach and many other things that Fernanda mentioned. So it's all part of it. It's not an either or. And in places, in countries that are successful in effectively implementing the legislation, it's actually guided by the appropriate policy and action plans stemming from the whole strategy of the government to deal with these issues, business ethics. So with that, also, I'd like to just touch on the thoughts related to the discussions around climate change. And indeed, they are extremely relevant, if not central, to any business ethics discussion, because it is understanding the context Fernanda spoke to, in which the businesses operate in, that is the starting point for these businesses to determine their best approach or their most effective measures for ensuring the human rights issues, the employees' human rights are addressed. And with the impact of climate change, as it relates to the effects of the adverse weather events, changes in temperature, effects on mental health issues, it's even more important to push those family-friendly policies at the business level and all of the policies that embrace, protect the human right aspects of persons. So it's all part of the same conversation, and it is the how it is factored into the discussions with the business sector.
Thank you, Dr. Gajadhar. And finally, Ashley, before to go to our closing remarks. Thank you, Ashley.
No, thank you. I can totally agree with what Fernanda and Alison would have mentioned. But I think too, to add on, I think what is important in addressing the topic, well, the question on the climate crisis is the monitoring and evaluation part. There are lots of environmental regulations. I know governments across the Caribbean have implemented varying policies as it relates to the climate crisis. But small island developing states only contribute a total of 1% of the total greenhouse gas emissions, such as fossil fuels. Yet we're seeing that there's so many different changes in our environments, as you rightfully mentioned, the flooding of islands, extreme heat, and the pollution of our seas. But I think we're, as rightfully mentioned, that environmental issues is interconnected to business and human rights as well. But what we really need is to see a strengthening of regulatory frameworks and also a strengthening of policies that are being implemented. And as stakeholders, we must monitor the business regulatory framework, because oftentimes we see that businesses commit to X, but there's no monitoring or evaluation of how exactly they are doing what they're saying that they need to do. And Axel mentioned it in the beginning, where he also mentioned that we need to have a balance between going way beyond companies looking at just like profits, but also a balance between profits and people. And I think once we can merge those two together, we would see a cleaner adaptation within the renewable energy transition into cleaner energy sources. And I know many companies and countries, or especially Guyana, Jamaica, and other island nations also have a focus, and most of their financing outside of the tourism industry also comes from the manufacturing industry as well. So there needs to be a more cleaner and just transition within the energy transition sector. But this can't only be achieved without international cooperation, collaboration and cooperation, collaborating with varying international agencies, doing the necessary data collection and research to really support the necessary climate impacts that we're seeing in the Caribbean. But I think for me, it will go towards public education and sensitization and awareness, but also monitoring of the businesses and the evaluation of the businesses. I think that is what we need more of. Thank you.
Ashley, thank you so much for your reflections, and thanks again for all the panelists who joined us today. And now unfortunately, we don't have any more time. I'm going to Fernanda Hoppenheim again for some closing remarks. Thank you so much again for all your reflections and experience. Fernanda, please.
Well, thank you, Joanna. Thank you, panelists. This was a great conversation, hopefully the first of many. We've called it an inaugural dialogue because we hope this really kind of opens up a path of working together, of collaborating, of finding these spaces for exchange, for reflections, for participation, and hopefully further down the line for concrete commitments from governments, from companies, from business associations to move the agenda forward. I think there is a lot of interest. I hear there are, there is some progress in different fronts. And there is the appetite for engaging in these conversations and moving the agenda forward, both from states and different governments, and also from civil society and academics and the business sector for sure. And I'm sure local communities have a lot to say on this, indigenous peoples, and women's groups, etc. So I hope we can continue to engage different stakeholders in these conversations. I just want to end by thanking, of course, our partners in this effort, the UNDP, the team. Thank you, everybody, for all your hard work on this. UNICEF, thank you, colleagues, for your engagement and commitment to this dialogue and this work. Of course, the team at OHCHR, part of the RBC LAC project. Thank you, colleagues, for all the hours you put into organizing this dialogue. And to the panelists, again, thank you for being part of this conversation. And of course, to all the attendees, thank you so much for staying with us for the past 2 hours, for your questions and for your interest in this agenda. And again, I hope this is the first of many different activities and dialogues and exchanges, and that this can generate momentum for us to work on this agenda together, and that we can meet in person in 2024 and have much more time to engage in these discussions. Thank you so much. And thank you, Joanna, for your moderation and facilitation throughout this event.
Thank you to everyone again. So we hope you have a really nice day today, and we will be in touch again with the record of this event. And of course, as well, Fernanda said, we hope to see you again in 2024. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Joanna. Thank you, Fernando.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.